It always starts the same way. A request wrapped in expectation sent without warning, as if I've been waiting my whole life to be needed on command. Send the money today, Rachel. And don't start being sensitive again. That was the message. No, hello. No, how are you? Just the same quiet command with the same old warning. Don't feel too much. Don't speak too much. Don't be. I didn't respond. Not right away. I stared at the screen like it had insulted me out loud. Maybe it had. The worst part. It wasn't new. It was routine. Expected. The emotional equivalent of breathing in secondhand smoke. You don't even notice how toxic it is until you start coughing. I stood in my kitchen, hand resting on the edge of the counter, heart doing that fast but not panicked thing. Tight chest. Dry mouth. Guilt bubbling before I'd even said a word. It was my birthday. All I wanted was a quiet evening alone. No obligations. No emotional landmines. Just peace. But peace doesn't live in this family. Performing does. Teasing. Paying. Staying small. My mother, Linda, had perfected the art of control disguised as concern. Every conversation was laced with invisible rules. Don't talk back. Don't disagree. Don't make her feel wrong. She could cut you down with 3 syllables and a tilted head. My father, Chuck, played the role of neutral, silent, stern, always busy. He didn't insult me. He just reminded me of what I owed them. Subtly. Coldly. Like love came with a ledger. And then there was Ryan. My older brother. Always on their side. Always amused by my overreactions. He didn't even bother to pretend. He wore his dismissal like cologne. In our house, emotions were only acceptable if they were convenient. Gratitude was allowed. Silence was preferred. Anything else? Too much. Too dramatic. Too Rachel. I used to believe them. For years I swallowed myself whole, cut my feelings down to bite-sized pieces they could stomach. I apologized for things I didn't do, paid for things I couldn't afford and called it love. But something had been shifting. Quietly. Slowly. Not a rebellion. A rebalancing. I wasn't trying to be cold. I was trying to be clear. And right now clarity told me not to send the money. Not tonight. I took a deep breath, the kind that feels like swallowing glass, and poured myself a glass of water just to buy a moment. My hands shook slightly. Not out of fear. Out of habit. That's what anxiety does. Makes your body remember things your mind has worked hard to forget. I stood there for a long time letting the silence wrap around me. Not the cold silence of their disapproval. My silence. The kind I was learning to keep for myself. And in that stillness, one quiet thought rose like steam. What if I wasn't overreacting? What if I've been reacting to years of being gaslit, minimized, and rewritten? What if too sensitive was just their way of saying, stop noticing the truth? I didn't text back. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't owe them a performance. Not anymore. That night I didn't cry. I didn't explain. I didn't beg to be understood. I just chose not to abandon myself again. And for the first time in years I realized. They weren't asking for help. They were testing how much of me I was still willing to give. And this time, I gave them nothing. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset but because something had shifted inside me. Quietly like a floorboard giving way under years of pressure. After so many years of reacting, appeasing, explaining, I had finally chosen silence, and this time it was mine. And in that silence, my mind wandered not to the present but backward, into the soft, shadowed corners of my childhood, where the foundation for all of this was quietly laid. I was 7 when I first learned that my feelings were a problem. I had come home from school crying after a girl in my class called me weird. My heart had broken in that way children's hearts do, fast, deep, and without filter. All I wanted was comfort. What I got was correction. Oh, stop, my mother had said, barely glancing up. You're too sensitive. People won't like you if you take everything so personally. It wasn't cruel. That was the tricky part. Sounded like advice. But something in me recoiled, small, confused, ashamed for feeling at all. That was the first time I questioned whether my pain was valid. And it wouldn't be the last. My room became my shelter. 4 pale pink walls, soft carpet, neatly arranged books and stuffed animals. It was the only place where I could feel without being observed. I kept it obsessively tidy, because if I couldn't control the moods in my house, I could at least control the chaos in my space. I lined up my markers by color, alphabetized my books, folded my clothes twice over. Looking back, I understand now, that wasn't about cleanliness. It was about safety. My mother Linda didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her power lived in her tone, calm, clipped, certain. Her favorite phrase was, "Don't make everything a big deal." It made me doubt the size of my feelings even when they felt enormous to me. When I cried, she told me to stop performing. When I disagreed, she said I was twisting the truth. And when I asked her to listen, she said I was overreacting. Every feeling was too much. Every emotion was inconvenient. But the way she said it, with a soft voice and a practiced smile, made me feel like I was the one losing touch with reality. My father, Chuck, was quieter still. He didn't dismiss me with words but with absence. He sat at the dinner table behind his newspaper, offering raised eyebrows instead of comfort and money instead of presents. If I asked for attention, he offered a solution. If I asked to be seen, he handed me a task. Affection felt like something you earned, not something freely given. And even then, only if you didn't rock the boat. Ryan, my brother, was 5 years older and always knew how to stay on their good side. He mocked my emotions the same way they did, smiling, shaking his head, saying things like, "Here we go again," whenever I tried to speak up. He was praised for being strong, for keeping his cool. I was constantly told to calm down, or stop making things worse. I grew up believing that sensitivity was a flaw, that asking to be heard was an act of aggression, and that silence was my only safety. There was no chaos in our home. No slammed doors. No dramatic fights. But that's what made it harder to understand. When the abuse is quiet, when it's dressed in normalcy, you learn to doubt your own instincts. You become your own censor. I stopped asking for comfort because I couldn't bear the shame of being told I didn't need it. I learned to read moods like traffic lights. I monitored tone, posture, breathing, anything that would give me a clue about whether I was safe to be myself. They never told me to disappear. They just made sure there was no room for me to fully exist. So I folded. Not in defiance but in desperation. I became smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I didn't want to be a burden. I just wanted to be allowed. But what I didn't know then was that survival isn't the same as peace. And shrinking to fit doesn't mean you're loved. It means you're tolerated. And love should never feel like that. There were rules in our house. Not written down. Not even spoken out loud most of the time. But they were there, woven into the silence between meals and the tension that settled in after every disagreement. You learned them early like instinct. And once you knew them, you obeyed because breaking them didn't bring chaos. It brought something worse: withdrawal. Disappointment. That quiet, piercing sense of not belonging. The first rule was simple: don't talk back. But it didn't just mean don't argue. It meant don't question. Don't challenge. Don't push for clarification when something didn't feel right. If an adult in the house said something, anything, your job wasn't to understand it. Your job was to accept it. Smile. Nod. Swallow your discomfort and move on. As a child, I didn't have the language for injustice. All I knew was that when something hurt and I said so, the pain doubled. First from the incident. Then from the reaction. My mother would look at me like I'd embarrassed her just by having a reaction. "It's not that deep, Rachel. You're reading too much into it. Stop twisting things." Each phrase was a soft knife, dull enough to not kill a moment, but sharp enough to leave a mark that lingered. The second rule: protect the image. We were a respectable family. Middle class, stable, decent. My parents never fought in public. We wore coordinated clothes at family gatherings, smiled for pictures, said all the right things to the outside world. But the truth was that image came at a cost. It required someone to absorb the discomfort, to carry the emotional tension no one else wanted to acknowledge. That someone was usually me. Because I asked questions. I had feelings. I noticed things. And in a family built on appearances, awareness is dangerous. So they labeled me difficult. Chuck, my father, never raised his voice. But the way he said my name when he was annoyed carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Rachel," he'd say, flat and cold, as if just existing had interrupted something important. He didn't like being questioned. Especially not by his daughter. Especially not when money was involved. If I asked why I had to help pay for something I didn't use, I was being ungrateful. If I wondered why Ryan wasn't asked to help, I was being petty. If I hesitated to send money or asked for more time, I was accused of making things difficult. And difficult women, I learned, are the first to be silenced. Ryan picked up that rule early. He didn't need to understand me, just needed to reflect my parents' disapproval back at me. He learned that aligning with them made his life easier. And mine lonelier. By the time I was a teenager, I spoke carefully. I edited myself constantly. I measured my tone, softened my words, and apologized just for bringing up how I felt. Because I knew, if I didn't play along, I'd be punished. Not with grounding or yelling. But with coldness. Dismissal. That sharp, polite distance that made me feel invisible. So I became fluent in emotional translation. I learned to say things that wouldn't make them uncomfortable, even if it meant swallowing the truth. I became a version of myself that was easier to digest. Easier to praise. easier to ignore. The real me, the curious, expressive, emotionally deep me, was tucked away. Too risky. Too much. Looking back, I realized that these weren't just house rules. They were generational survival tactics. My parents didn't invent them, they inherited them. But instead of breaking the cycle, they enforced it. And I, desperate to be loved, desperate to belong, followed it. The rule was, don't talk back. But really what they meant was, don't speak your truth. Because truth disrupts comfort. And in our family, comfort came before honesty. Always. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to shrink my emotions before they left my mouth. I'd pause in conversations, not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I was editing it in real time, trimming it down, reshaping it, making sure it wouldn't sound too much. I had learned that too sad was attention-seeking. Too angry was disrespectful. Too happy was suspicious. Every feeling had a limit. Every emotion came with a warning label. And somehow mine were always too loud, too heavy, too inconvenient. It wasn't that they told me I wasn't allowed to feel. They just made sure I understood that my feelings needed to be adjusted, to fit the moment, to fit their comfort, to fit a version of me they could tolerate. I remember once being excited about winning a writing contest in school. I came home smiling, ready to tell someone, anyone. My mother barely looked up from her phone. That's nice. Did you remember to empty the dishwasher? One sentence and the joy drained right out of me. I tucked the certificate away in my drawer and never mentioned it again. I started learning that joy, just like pain, needed permission. By high school, I had become hyper-aware of my emotional volume. If I felt something strongly, I'd second-guess whether I was being dramatic. If I cried, I'd apologize mid-tear. I would rehearse how to bring up concerns, soften them, bury them under disclaimers, lead with, I know this probably isn't a big deal, but... because even acknowledging my own discomfort felt like a threat to the people around me. And if they were uncomfortable, I was guilty. That guilt, constant low-grade humming like background noise, grew into something else over time. I started feeling it in my body. Tightness in my chest. A racing mind that wouldn't quiet at night. Sleeplessness without any real reason. And still, I didn't call it anxiety. I didn't know how to name something that had always felt like a personality flaw. I just thought I was bad at handling life. Too fragile. Too emotional. Too everything. Nobody around me was talking about mental health. My family saw therapy as something for other people. People who were broken. People who couldn't hold themselves together. We weren't allowed to fall apart. We were raised to function no matter how hollow we felt. The only acceptable emotions were silence and service. Get things done. Show up. Don't burden anyone. So I got good at appearing fine. At smiling when I wasn't. At offering help before anyone could question my value. I poured myself into being useful, because usefulness I thought might buy me belonging. I paid bills when I wasn't asked. I kept the peace when it wasn't mine to keep. I said yes even when my chest screamed no. And when I finally cracked under the weight of it, I blamed myself for being weak. It never occurred to me that I was drowning in expectations that were never mine to carry. That maybe I wasn't broken, just exhausted. That maybe the shame I felt wasn't born in me, but handed to me every time someone minimized what I felt. The worst part was, even when I knew something was wrong, I still questioned my right to feel it. I'd ask myself, is this really that bad? Am I overthinking it? Maybe I'm just not strong enough. That loop ran constantly in my mind, tightening with each passing year. And because no one ever validated my experience, I kept defaulting to the same conclusion. I must be the problem. But even then, in the quiet corners of my mind, something in me whispered back, soft and steady, what if you're not the problem? What if your feelings were never too big? What if the space you were given was just too small? I didn't believe it yet. Not fully. But the whisper was there. And it was getting louder. It didn't happen in the middle of a crisis. That's what surprised me. I always imagined panic attacks as something dramatic. Something reserved for people going through divorce, grief, loss. But mine happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a grocery store holding a basket of lemons. There was nothing unusual about that day. I had left work early, decided to cook something nice for myself. Maybe pasta, something with brightness. I remember standing in the produce section watching sunlight filter through the glass roof, and then suddenly, my vision narrowed. My chest tightened like someone had cinched a belt around my ribs. My hands began to shake. I couldn't breathe, Not in the dramatic gasping way but in the terrifying invisible way where each breath feels shallow, pointless. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop. Or explode. Or betray me completely. I froze. Stood there like someone had unplugged me from the moment. Around me people kept moving, grabbing apples, checking prices, pushing carts. But I was gone. Somewhere inside myself, spiraling. I dropped the basket. Lemons rolled in every direction. A man bent to help me, asked if I was okay. I smiled and lied. I always smiled and lied. I'm fine. Just lightheaded. I'll be okay. I wasn't. I sat in my car for nearly an hour afterward, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to the present. My whole body felt electric, wrong, foreign. I kept thinking, what is happening to me? Why no? But somewhere beneath the confusion I already knew. My body had been trying to speak for years. I just hadn't been listening. That night I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, who would have said I needed more sleep. Not my father, who would have told me to stop overworking. Not Ryan, who would have laughed and said, maybe skip the caffeine. I didn't tell them because I already knew how the story would end, with me being too dramatic. With me being the problem. Instead, I typed the words panic attack symptoms into a search bar. And for the first time I saw myself reflected. Word for word. Symptom for symptom. Tight chest. Dizziness. Spiraling thoughts. Feeling detached from your own body. I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't overthinking. It was anxiety. And it had been there all along, hidden beneath years of emotional suppression, mislabeling, and guilt. I had just never had the permission, or the language, to name it. I spent hours that night reading. I clicked through articles, watched videos, scrolled forums of people describing their symptoms, their families, their confusion. So many of their stories sounded like mine. And for the first time in years I felt something like relief. Not because I was okay, but because I wasn't crazy. I wasn't broken. I was just overwhelmed, unheard, human. But that moment also terrified me. Because if this was real, if this wasn't just a bad day, then I had to admit that something in my life wasn't working. That my coping mechanisms weren't coping anymore. That the smiling, the caretaking, the appeasing had only delayed the inevitable. My body had spoken in the only language it could. It shut me down to wake me up. I slept poorly that night. Tossed and turned. Chest still tight. Every noise felt too loud. Every silence too sharp. But underneath the fear, something else had been born. A decision. Quiet, hesitant, but real. I would find someone to talk to. Not my family. Not someone who'd tell me I was imagining it. Someone who would listen without flinching, without fixing. I didn't know what healing would look like. I just knew I couldn't keep pretending I didn't need it. The door to the therapist's office was small, unremarkable, frosted glass, a modest sign. I stood outside for a few seconds before walking in, pretending I wasn't terrified. I had rehearsed the conversation all morning. What I'd say. What I wouldn't. How I'd downplay things just enough so I wouldn't sound broken, but still enough so she'd take me seriously. Her name was Dr. Elena Harper. Mid-40s, soft voice, firm presence. She didn't smile too much, which I liked. Made the space feel honest. Like I didn't have to perform. Like I could just exist. He asked me what brought me in. I hesitated. Then said, I think I had a panic attack. She nodded. Not in alarm, not in pity, just recognition. Tell me what was happening before it started. I talked. Carefully at first. But once I started, the words came fast, clumsy, like they'd been waiting years to be let out. I told her about the grocery store. About my chest feeling tight for months. About the constant need to be agreeable, calm, helpful. I told her about my mother's comments. My father's coldness. My brother's eye rolls. I told her about how I could never just feel something without being asked to shrink it. I must have talked for 20 minutes straight. And then softly she asked, has anyone ever used the term gaslighting with you? I blinked. My brain stuttered. I've heard of it, I said. But I don't know if it really applies. She nodded again. Kind. It often doesn't feel like it applies when you've lived in it for a long time. She explained what it meant. How gaslighting isn't always shouting or name-calling. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the quiet twisting of your memory. The invalidation of your feelings. The way someone convinces you that your emotional reality is wrong. That you're exaggerating. That you're the problem. I sat there frozen. Not because I didn't believe her, but because for the first time in my life someone had named the thing I'd been drowning in. And it didn't sound like blame. It sounded like clarity. Gaslighting. That was the word. The thread that pulled everything into focus. It explained the disorientation, the guilt, the way I'd walk away from conversations wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. It explained the exhaustion, not just from life but from constantly questioning whether I was allowed to feel what I felt. I told her hesitantly about a memory. When I was 19 and I confronted my mother about something she said, something that had hurt me deeply. I had rehearsed it for days. I'd written it down, practiced it in the mirror. But when I finally said it to her, she looked at me and said, "I never said that, Rachel. I think you just took it the wrong way." Again. I remembered how confused I'd felt. How embarrassed. How quickly I'd apologized. Dr. Harper just nodded. That's gaslighting. She didn't say it dramatically. She didn't ask for more proof. He just believed me. And in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. Validation. Not pity. Not sympathy. Not a solution. Just someone telling me, you're not imagining this. Your pain is real. Your memory is real. Your feelings are valid. I didn't cry in that first session. Thought I would. But I didn't. That I felt, still. Like a fog had finally lifted and I could see the shape of things. Not to blame, but to understand. That night I went home and wrote the word, gaslighting, in my journal. I underlined it twice. I stared at it like it was a map I hadn't known I'd needed. It didn't fix everything. But it gave me something I'd been missing for years. Language. And with language came permission. To stop apologizing, to stop doubting, and maybe, eventually, to start healing. I used to think healing would feel like a breakthrough. Like fireworks. Like something definitive, loud, obvious, cinematic. I imagined walking away from my past with a new version of myself. Someone who no longer second-guessed, no longer spiraled, no longer froze under pressure. I thought I'd wake up one day and just feel better. Clean. But that's not what healing looked like for me. Healing looked like pausing before I said, "I'm sorry," for no reason, and choosing not to say it. It looked like sitting with discomfort instead of rushing to fix it for everyone else. It looked like noticing when I started explaining myself too much, and stopping mid-sentence. Most days it didn't feel like healing at all. It felt like doubt. Like rewiring muscles I didn't know I had. Like learning to walk again without limping in places I didn't even know were injured. In therapy, Dr. Harper helped me name my patterns. Not with judgment but with quiet observation. He pointed out how often I minimized my own pain, how quickly I redirected conversation away from myself. She called it self-abandonment. That hit me hard. Because I had spent so long trying to be useful, to be easy to love, to be low maintenance. I didn't even realize I had been disappearing in the process. Sometimes I'd leave a session feeling raw. Exposed. Like I had peeled back another layer of protection and didn't know what to do with the skin underneath. Other times I'd leave feeling stronger, more grounded in myself than I had ever been. But most of the time I just felt quiet. Not broken. Just quiet. And that, I learned, was progress. I started setting small boundaries. The kind no one else noticed, but that felt monumental to me. Like not picking up the phone when my mother called during work hours. Like saying, "I can't help with that right now," when my father asked for a favor. Like letting a message from Ryan sit unread for a day or two instead of rushing to reply. They weren't confrontational moves. But they were intentional. And for someone like me, someone who had spent a lifetime earning love through compliance, they were radical. My mother didn't understand, of course. "Why are you being distant?" she'd ask. "You used to be so caring." What she meant was, you used to be available. You used to put us first. But I was done performing love on command. I was learning to care for myself in ways no one ever taught me to. There were setbacks. Guilt still visited like an old roommate who didn't know how to move out. Some days I'd slip back into old habits. Over-apologizing, over-giving, over-explaining. But I noticed them now. And noticing was part of the healing too. One night, I was washing dishes and caught myself replaying a conversation with my mother. Trying to dissect what I should have said differently, how I could have made her understand my side better. And then I stopped. Mid-thought. I whispered to myself, "You don't need to convince her. You get to feel what you feel." That moment didn't change the world. But it changed something in me. Healing, it turns out, isn't a finish line. It's a slow homecoming. It's the process of choosing yourself, again and again, especially when it feels unfamiliar. Especially when it feels selfish. Especially when everything in you has been conditioned to serve others first. It's not linear. It's not always visible. But it's real. And in the quiet moments, when I don't apologize for existing, when I trust my own memory, when I say no without a full essay of justification, I can feel it. I'm not becoming someone new. I'm remembering who I was before I learned to be small. For a while, I thought if I healed quietly, without blaming, without grand declarations, then maybe my family wouldn't notice. That maybe if I stepped back slowly enough, they'd simply adjust. Understand even. But they didn't. Because in families like mine, the roles aren't suggestions. They're contracts. And when you break them, you don't get grace. You get guilt. It started subtly. Missed calls from my mother that turned into passive-aggressive texts. Hope everything's okay, haven't heard from you. Followed by, I guess you're too busy these days. When I finally replied, she said I was being cold. That I used to be more loving. That therapy was making me selfish. It was the same tone she used when I was 12 and asked for space. She didn't say come back to the role, but I could hear it between every line. My father responded with silence. No arguments. No confrontations. Just long stretches of nothing. Then one day out of the blue he sent me a message. Reminder, property taxes due. We're short. No greeting. No check-in. Just a transaction. Like my distance hadn't earned me autonomy, only punishment. Ryan was more direct. So what, now you're too good for the family? He said during one of our rare calls. All this therapy stuff, you're making things harder than they need to be. I remember sitting there, phone to my ear, pulse steady, voice calm. I'm just setting boundaries, I told him. That's all. He laughed. Not kindly. Since when do you have boundaries? And there was the truth. My growth disrupted his comfort. My silence used to serve him. Now it threatened him. They didn't miss me. They missed the version of me that made their lives easier. It hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. Even when you expect the backlash, it still stings. Because somewhere deep down, the child in me was still hoping, still aching for a soft landing. For someone to say, I see why you had to step away. I'm sorry we made you feel like you couldn't breathe here. But that never came. Instead, I got distance dressed up as confusion. Anger disguised as concern. And the unspoken threat every cycle breaker knows too well. Come back to the role or lose us. For a few days I spiraled. I questioned myself. Was I being too harsh? Too distant? Was I punishing them instead of healing myself? Guilt wrapped around my ribs like a belt, just like it used to. Tight, familiar. But then I remembered something Dr. Harper said in session. Guilt is often just the residue of old programming. It shows up when you're doing something new, not something wrong. So I stayed the course. I didn't cut them off. I just stopped performing. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped rushing in to soothe their discomfort when they refused to acknowledge mine. I showed up only when I had the emotional capacity. I contributed only when it didn't come at the cost of my peace. And when the accusations came, you've changed. You're cold. You're selfish now. I didn't try to convince them otherwise. I let the discomfort be theirs to hold. Because here's what no one tells you about healing. When you reclaim your voice, people who relied on your silence will call it cruelty. When you protect your time, those who benefited from your overextension will call it abandonment. And when you finally learn to say no, those who loved your constant yes will question your love entirely. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're finally right with yourself. So I kept going. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Just with clarity. The kind that doesn't need to scream to be heard. The kind that feels like standing still in the middle of a storm. Not untouched but unmoved. Because I knew now, I wasn't the villain in their story. I just stopped being their shadow. I turned 32 on a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic. No party. No cake. Just a quiet dinner I planned for myself. A small act of peace after a long, unraveling year. I lit a candle in my apartment, poured a glass of wine, and made pasta from scratch because I still believed in honoring myself even in silence. I had taken the day off work. No plans. No expectations. Just the hope that for once the world would leave me alone. It didn't. At 4:13 p.m. my phone lit up. It was my mother. I stared at her name for a while, debating whether to answer. I knew the rhythm by now. Calls that never started with, happy birthday, unless they ended with, by the way, we need something. Still, some small part of me, a part one thought had shrunk, answered anyway. Hope, I guess, dies slower than we think. Rachel, she said. No greeting. No warmth. Just a name sharp like a command. I need you to transfer money for the house maintenance. Today. It's urgent. No, how are you? No, I know it's your birthday. Just need. Just urgency. Just the old script. I took a breath. Mom, can it wait? Just for tonight? I've made plans. There was a pause. Then the tone changed, thinly veiled disappointment. Wow. On your birthday? We've done everything for you and now you can't help with one thing? We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I stood still in my kitchen, candle flickering beside me, hearing her words fall like stones into my chest. Not loud. Just heavy. And familiar. So painfully familiar. That soft twist of guilt. That subtle sting of being selfish. And somewhere between the sentence and the silence that followed, something in me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain that I'd already paid for the roof last month, or that Ryan could help too, or that it was my birthday and I just wanted to feel like a daughter instead of a transaction. I just stood there, breathing, listening to my heart beat like a quiet threat. And then, without planning it, I whispered to myself, not for her, not even aloud, just for me. This isn't love. This is control. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But final. It was like a spell broke. A fog I didn't know I was still living in began to lift. All those years I had called it family duty. All those times I'd excused the demands as sacrifice. It all collapsed under the weight of that single realization. They didn't love me for me. They loved what I gave. What I solved. How I softened the cracks. And the moment I stopped playing that role, their love shifted into pressure. I didn't send the money that night. I didn't call back to explain. I didn't apologize for saying no. Instead, I blew out the candle, washed my plate, and sat on my couch in the quiet. The guilt came, of course. Like it always did. It wrapped around my spine, whispered old stories in my ear. You're ungrateful. You're selfish. You'll regret this. But this time I didn't collapse under it. I just let it pass. Like weather. Like a memory. Because this time I wasn't confused. I knew what I was feeling. I knew what it meant. This wasn't a tantrum. This was liberation. Not from them necessarily. But from the idea that I had to earn love by abandoning myself. For the first time, I realized that healing wasn't about fixing the family. It was about finally choosing me. I used to believe that if I stopped showing up as the version of me my family expected, I'd be alone. That if I dropped the smiling, the over-apologizing, the predictable yes, they'd leave. And for a while I was right. Things got quiet. Texts slowed. Holidays got awkward. There were no dramatic fights. Just space. Distance. Echoes. But something unexpected happened in that quiet. I didn't break. I didn't spiral. I exhaled. For the first time I had room to hear my own voice without theirs layered on top. I didn't have to second-guess every feeling. I didn't have to rehearse conversations in my head before saying anything out loud. I didn't have to carry everyone else's emotions like they were my responsibility. I could just be. And that, I've learned, is a kind of freedom many of us don't recognize until we've lost everything that made us feel responsible for surviving. I still see them. Sometimes. The family group thread is still active, though I rarely respond unless it's practical. My mother still calls, mostly when she needs something. My father sends the occasional message with a payment reminder or a piece of unsolicited advice. Ryan sends memes that feel like stand-ins for connection. It's all surface. No depth. And I've stopped digging. Because here's what I know now. I don't owe anyone the version of me that made their lives easier at the cost of my own. I don't owe anyone the silence that kept the peace. I don't owe anyone the smile I used to wear like armor. I owe myself honesty, boundaries, and breath. Healing didn't turn me into a new person. It revealed the person I always was before I learned to contort myself into something palatable. Before I shrank my emotions. Before I measured my worth in usefulness. Before I believed that love and sacrifice were the same thing. I've stopped trying to prove anything. Not because I don't care, but because I finally understand that being misunderstood is not a threat. It's a consequence of no longer molding myself into what others find digestible. And I can live with that. Some people will never see the full version of me. Not because I'm hiding. but because they're not willing to look past the role I used to play. And that's okay. I've built something for myself now. A quiet life. A clear mind. A nervous system that no longer lives in constant defense. I've surrounded myself with people who don't need me to shrink in order to stay. People who meet me with presence instead of pressure. Who listen. Who reflect back clarity instead of confusion. It's not a large circle, but it's mine. I still go to therapy. Not because I'm broken, but because I finally believe I'm worth the effort. I journal more than I talk to most people. I take long walks without checking my phone. I say no without adding 3 sentences of justification. These things used to feel like rebellion. Now they feel like home. And when the guilt shows up, because it still does sometimes, I don't argue with it. I greet it. Say, I see you. I know where you came from. But I'm not going back. I am no longer available for the kind of love that requires me to disappear. I am no longer available for families that mistake control for care. And I am no longer afraid of who I am without their approval. I am Rachel Morgan. Quiet, steady, whole. And I don't owe anyone an apology for that.